We return today to the pilgrim songs of the Old Testament, Psalm 120 to 135. These are the prayers and songs that would have been memorized by people on the go, people who had not yet arrived at their destination. That's just like you and me. And maybe as we work our way week by week through these pilgrim songs, you will find your own experience and life there too. These are called the Psalms of Ascent in the Old Testament. Why do you suppose they have that label? Well, there's a very obvious and literal answer to that. So up on the screen is a topographical map of Israel. The red star is where Jerusalem is located. That is where these pilgrims, as they came and went, would be singing these psalms at least 3 times a year as they journeyed for feasts. Jerusalem is at about 2,500 feet elevation, and no matter where you're coming from in Israel, west, east, north, or south, you're going to climb to get to it. For example, if you're coming from the east in the Jordan River near, let's say, the town of Jericho, you're going to climb almost 3,500 feet to get to Jerusalem for the feast. Hence, the Psalms of Ascent, the Psalms of climbing. Today, the psalm in view for us is Psalm 124. Let me read it for us at the start of the sermon. If it had not been the Lord who was on our side, let Israel now say. If it had not been the Lord who was on our side when our enemies attacked us, then they would have swallowed us up alive. When their anger was kindled against us, then the flood would have swept us away, and the torrent would have gone over us, and likewise the raging waters. Blessed be the Lord, who has not given us as prey to their teeth. We have escaped like a bird from the snare of the hunters. The snare is broken, and we have escaped. Our help is in the name of the Lord, who made heaven and earth. This is a psalm about 2 things. It is about an unnerving, insurmountable predicament that all of us will face from time to time. And it is about its only possible solution. The first thing described in this psalm is helplessness, powerlessness. The psalmist stacks up 6 metaphors for the feeling or experience of helplessness. God's people on occasion feel like, here are the 6 metaphors, like their enemies are attacking them. Like they will be swallowed whole in life by their adversaries. That they are being the focus of someone else's kindled anger. That they will drown in the raging waters that are overtaking them. That they are predators being sought, they are prey being sought by predators, and they feel trapped as if somebody were hunting them. What this psalm does, if nothing else, and it is not unique in the corpus of the Psalms in the Old Testament, is it normalizes the experience of feeling helpless and powerless from time to time for God's people. And admit with me that we live in a culture that tries as hard as it can to never admit that we feel helpless or powerless. No matter what you face in life, no matter who you face, no matter how dire things are, our culture wants to tell you that if you just try harder, if you just learn a little more, if you just tap the right expertise, then you will no longer feel helpless or powerless. And the Psalm says, yeah, not always. There are times you feel like you're drowning in life. There are times you feel like you're trapped in life. There are times you feel like you are the focus of unquenchable anger. You ever experienced that? Where a friend or a coworker or someone else in your life is livid with you, and you do not understand why, but moreover, there is literally nothing you can do to assuage or dampen the raging prairie fire that is their anger toward you. In that moment, you probably felt like what the psalmist is describing. Have you ever felt trapped, ensnared, to use another metaphor from the psalm, in someone else's evil? Have you ever been a part of a group or maybe a part of a company where you worked and you're like, this is the most dysfunctional thing I have ever been a part of, and there is nothing I can do about it. I either have to put up with it or I have to quit. And my family has to go without my income. In that moment, you may, in your own individual small way, have experienced something like what the psalmist is describing. But the metaphor that gets the most space in the psalm can be found in verses 4 and 5, which read that God's people on occasion feel like the flood has swept over us and the torrent would have gone over us, and also the raging waters. Now, that may not sound like anything to you or just mere imagery to you, but you have to read it in its historical, cultural setting. In the Old Testament especially, whenever you see the metaphor of roiling waves, stormy waters, it's talking about something specific. It's talking about this chaos in the world, this evil in the world that seems to have been around for all of our history, since in fact the dawn of creation. It's talking about these things in the world that are seemingly outside of our control, however much it is that they hurt us and they hurt other people. Shirley Guthrie is a Presbyterian theologian. In his book, Christian Doctrine, he describes this perspective on evil that you see here in this image of stormy waters and raging seas this way. Quote, according to the scripture, evil that was unleashed at the very beginning of history and has been at work through all history will be there to the very end. History is the story of the past, present, and future power of evil that threatens to spoil and destroy God's creation. Evil appears so strong that it seems not just to be the enemy of God, but also to be victorious over God. Evil is more than sin. When we sin, we come under the spell of a power that seems greater than ourselves or our ability to resist it. A power from which we cannot free ourselves no matter how hard we try. We don't just do evil. We are trapped and controlled by evil. It dwells in us, yet somehow also has an existence of its own outside of us, end quote. That's what the psalmist is describing, and I'll bet you know this experience too. Have you had a moment recently, maybe when you're reading your favorite news site online, you hear the latest tragedy in the world, You hear the latest place in our country where we cannot come to an agreement about a very important or timely issue. And you throw your hands up in the air, and just for a moment you say to yourself, how on earth are we still, as the human race, struggling with these things? How is it there are still hungry people in the world when there is plenty of food in the world? How is it that people cannot pay their rent or afford to buy a home in a country where there is plenty of housing, even if it's not affordable? How is it that there are wars and still rumors of war? How is it that people in various parts of the world are persecuted for their faith by people of faith? How are we still doing this? It's the 21st century, and yet it seems like we're no better than moral Neanderthals. You see what Shirley Guthrie means. You see the power, the visceral power of this image in the Old Testament. This chaos and evil has afflicted all of history, and there are times in the face of it you and I can feel nothing other than helpless and powerless. But we do need to push pause. And we who have the luxury of living middle class to upper middle class suburban lives need to realize that for many of us, maybe most of us, we will never face the helplessness and powerlessness that ancient Israel did as described in Psalm 124. Psalm 124 is written probably after the exile to Babylon. Here's what you need to know about what the people of God called Israel in the Old Testament experienced. For their entire history, they were under constant threat of being invaded by a stronger outside foreign power. They had at least once in their history been uprooted from their homeland and taken away to be slaves or serfs in another. They were regularly exploited by foreign powers who taxed them into utter poverty, beginning with Egypt, then going to Assyria, then going to Babylon, then going to Persia. And they, every generation, had to face the specter of famine that would kill so many of the people they knew and loved. They had to face unchecked disease. This is not the world that you and I live in. This is not the kind of helplessness that you and I experience. And it's only when we read the Bible and hear it with people who in other parts of the world do experience this kind of thing that we realize, yeah, we're not that helpless. In fact, we know that today, 2024, there are 30 ongoing conflicts in the world that are either revolutions in a country that are destroying that country or conflicts between countries. We know that in 2023, there were 120 million people in the world who became homeless or refugees because of those conflicts. We know in 2023 that 1 out of 10 people in the world don't have adequate food to eat. We know that half of the human race today does not have access to adequate health care, and as such are possibly the victim of disease and pestilence. Yeah, you and I don't know that kind of powerlessness and helplessness. Which is why it's important for us to realize that there are people in the world who experience impotence and vulnerability in a way that you and I never will. And the first thing you and I need to be willing to do is to notice it. To stop just a little bit in our busy lives, to pause in the affluence that God has given us and recognize, boy, there are so many people who have it worse than us. The great Irish playwright and activist George Bernard Shaw said it this way: the worst sin toward our fellow creatures is not to hate them, it's to be indifferent to them. That's the essence of inhumanity. You and I are fortunate to be a part of a Christian group who prioritizes the fact that we who have enough, we who get to live relatively safe and secure lives, will prioritize noticing, coming alongside, and joining together with those who have less than us, those who need our support, our care, our love, our advocacy. In fact, beginning next week in that 11 o'clock adult Sunday school hour class, Modern Perspectives on Ancient Christian Truth, one of the new creeds of the PCUSA that we're going to explore is called the Belhar Confession. And in it you will encounter these two paragraphs, something that our denomination says strikes at the very heart of what it means to live like a Christian in the modern world. Quote, "The church must therefore stand by people in any form of suffering and need, which implies, among other things, that the church must witness against and strive against any form of injustice, so that justice may roll down like water and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. The church as the possession of God must stand where the Lord stands, namely against injustice and with the wronged. That in following Christ, the church must witness against all the powerful and privileged who selfishly seek their own interests and thus control and harm others." End quote. Yeah, sadly, you and I don't really know what it's like to experience what ancient Israel did, because in a way that makes us indifferent to people who do. But our call as Christian people is to notice, to pay attention, to come alongside, to join, to advocate, to listen, and to speak up. This is what this psalm calls to us about. But this is only half of the psalm. This is a psalm about helplessness, but it is a psalm about something else too. If helplessness is the unnerving, insurmountable predicament that all of us in our own way will face from time to time, then here is the only possible solution according to Psalm 124. Anytime, by the way, the Bible repeats itself, if you're reading through a text or a passage and you notice that words or phrases or sentences are repeated, you need to notice, because that's the point. And this is how the psalm starts. If it had not been the Lord who was on our side, let Israel now say, if it had not been the Lord who was on our side. What's the point of the psalm? We are helpless and we are powerless, and we will all encounter experiences in our life that will make us feel that way. However, God is on our side. So while it may be normal from time to time to feel impotent and vulnerable, it is also true that as people of faith, we ought to be able to look backward in our journey, our pilgrimage, and see times in our life where if God had not been on our side, if God had not intervened, we would have been done for. John Wesley, the great founder of Methodism, once said, "As long as you feel your weakness and helplessness, you will be able to find help from above." Did you catch it? It is only when you and I, from time to time, admit I am facing something that I cannot resolve on my own that we have the hope of then reaching out to God, who can be our help in a way that no one else can. Perhaps there is something in your life about which you feel powerless this morning. I am sorry for that and the way that it rends your heart. On the other hand, you may be in the place where you need to be, because from that place you will cry out to God, who alone can be your help and rescue. The Barna Group, which is an evangelical research group here in America, 12 years ago, asked Americans, what's your favorite Bible verse? American adults replied, God helps those who help themselves. Small, tiny, infinitesimal problem. That is not in the Bible anywhere. You know where it comes from? It comes from ancient Greece. There was a religious maxim in ancient Greece that went, if the gods help those who help themselves. That's not from the Bible. That's from Plato. That's from myths in Greece. Sure, should you do the things in your life that are wise and loving and that care for yourself and others? Absolutely. But you also need to realize that the core of the gospel of Jesus is that God helps those who can't help themselves. Not that God helps those who can. So I don't know how you feel stuck or oppressed or weighed down or powerless this morning. But what I do know is that there is one and only one possible conquering solution, and that's the God who's on your side. I'll finish here. This is how a leading American Old Testament scholar named Walter Brueggemann summarizes the message of Psalm 124. He says, to profess that God is our help is to admit that we are not enough and that all of us need divine help. We're going to move into a time of reflection and then prayer. And what I'd like you to do is spend the next minute or so reflecting upon and praying about these things up on the screen. Maybe what you'll want to do is think back on times in your life where you were sunk if God did not intervene, and you want to thank God that He did for you what the psalmist describes Him doing for ancient Israel in Psalm 124. Or maybe this morning you feel helpless and vulnerable in your own life in a very specific, certain way. Spend the next few seconds talking to God about that and asking Him to come to your aid. Or maybe there's someone else in your life, a friend, a neighbor, a family member, who is also in their own way helpless and powerless. Take the next few seconds and lift them up to God and ask Him to come to their rescue.